They burned libraries and buried names. They rewrote maps and called it history. But while Europe clawed out of the Dark Ages, 5 African queens were building empires, fielding armies, and bending the ancient world to their will. This is the story they tried to erase. Stay, because what you're about to hear will change what you think you know about history. They taught you Europe made the world. They left out whole continents. Today, we begin to undo a lie purpose-built to justify conquest. The idea that Africa had no complex states, no monumental architecture, no powerful rulers worth remembering. That lie justified theft, slavery, and empire. What we'll do in the next 25 minutes is simple. We will name what they tried to name. We will tell the stories of 5 queens, rulers who commanded armies, ruled trade, negotiated with empires, and in some cases beat Rome. These women were not anomalies. They were products of societies with law, scholarship, and wealth. They minted coins, built pyramids, and maintained universities that taught astronomy, law, and medicine centuries before some European cities even had stone walls. This is not myth. This is recorded by contemporary travelers, preserved in oral traditions, and confirmed by archaeology. But for centuries, the victors of empire had motive to erase these stories. Why? Because if the colonizer admits the colonized once built empires of comparable power, it's a moral scaffolding that justified slavery and colonization collapses. That's the motive behind textbooks stripped of African voices and museum labels that hide provenances. Our first queen's story reaches nearly 3,000 years, actually controlled trade routes so valuable they made kings kneel. The next queen humiliated a Roman emperor's pride and forced the peace treaty on a world power. A third resisted Portuguese slavers for 30 years, a fourth performed feats of statecraft and construction rivaling any medieval city in Europe, and the fifth, she carved a kingdom out of the savannah and fortified it with walls that still stand. Over the next minutes, we'll meet them, examine the evidence, and confront the hard truth. History was not neutral, it was wielded as a weapon. Let's begin where most narratives start to unravel: the ancient Red Sea and the land between, Africa and Arabia, where trade and empire. To understand why these queens mattered, we must first see their world, an intercontinental web of trade linking Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Long before European ships dominated global maps, African ports shipped incense, gold, ivory, and textiles across the sea lanes. Control of those trade routes meant political influence and enormous wealth. One queen, the one many know by a story tangled with legend, used this power not as ornament, but as statecraft. She sent envoys loaded with frankincense and myrrh, spices and gold, to test rivals, forge alliances, and secure dynastic futures. Frankincense and myrrh were not just luxuries. They were the petrochemical of the ancient world, used in temples, medicine, and monarchic rituals. Whoever controlled them controlled religious economy for entire regions. This queen negotiated with Solomon, diplomats tell, and returned with a line of succession that, in local traditions, became an imperial dynasty spanning millennia. Now imagine the reaction of medieval European scholars when presented with an African dynasty that claimed antiquity equal to theirs. Discomfort followed by reinterpretation. Geography was twisted, narratives were changed, origins were reassigned. That's the first pattern. When evidence challenged Eurocentric worldview, interpreters recast it to fit a story of European primacy. But the sources we'll rely on are stubborn. Greek and Roman travelers who chronicle African kingdoms, Arab geographers who recorded cities of learning in West Africa, stone inscriptions that survived the fires of time. These aren't fairy tales. They are fragments of a larger archive, enough to reconstruct sovereign states and to prove beyond political spin that Africans ruled, traded, and wrote the rules of international diplomacy long before European hegemony. Let's travel now to Kush, land of the Nile's great southern reaches. Kush was not a marginal outpost. It built pyramids, minted coins, and corresponded with empires. The rulers of Kush used a title that scholars transcribed as Kandake or Candace, a title for women who ruled in their own right. That title signaled institutionalized female authority, not an exception. Imagine a polity where warrior queens were a political norm, where royal women commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and issued decrees. One of these Kandaks led forces against Rome. In one recorded confrontation, Kushite forces captured the bronze head of a Roman emperor, broke it from its pedestal, and buried it beneath temple steps so that citizens would walk over his face. Roman historians, embarrassed and angry, tried to ignore or belittle the episode, yet archaeology supports Kush's wealth and statecraft. Pyramids that rival those north of the border, temples with inscriptions, and evidence of literacy and administration. The Kandak was a product of that world. She was not a footnote in a male lineage. He was a sovereign, central to the state's diplomacy and military planning. For Rome, accustomed to male generals and patriarchal kings, the rise of such female authority was disconcerting. That dissonance is part of why accounts were minimized or slanted. Though when multiple external sources, Merovingian traders, Roman envoys, and later Arab geographers, confirm elements of Kushite power, you can piece together a consistent picture: an African civilization of great antiquity and a tradition of female rulers with political legitimacy attested across centuries. Across the Red Sea, in the Incense Kingdom spanning modern Ethiopia and southern Arabia, the Queen of Sheba emerges in multiple traditions: Ethiopic, Arabian, Jewish, and Christian. Her story blends myth and diplomatic history: a sovereign who traveled to test a famed foreign king, who returned with wealth and political clout. Local traditions placed her squarely within a literate state that managed long-distance trade in frankincense, myrrh, and precious stones. More than a legend, she symbolizes an institutional capacity to field navies, levy tribute, and sponsor monumental building. Her image was inconvenient for scholars who wanted to de-Africanize any sign of complexity. As a result, the Queen of Sheba was often recategorized as Arabian or Middle Eastern to avoid acknowledging a black African political center. That the archaeological record in Ethiopia, ancient inscriptions, monumental architecture, and continuing royal genealogies in Ethiopian tradition attest to a polity with institutions sophisticated enough to interact with Hebrew and Mesopotamian states. This matters because the Queen of Sheba's narrative demonstrates how gender intersected with power. Not token queenship, but dynastic, diplomatic authority that shaped regional geopolitics. She negotiated alliances, built dynasties, and managed resources critical to the ancient economy. When we retell her story honestly without the erasures or racial assumptions, we begin to see a map of late antiquity where African polities are active agents, not passive backdrops for external empire. Now step into Nubia and Kush more deeply, where queens with the title Kandak are repeatedly reported in Greco-Roman and later chronicles. One Kandak in particular stands out. She marched north to confront Roman demands, raised an army, and delivered humiliating blows to Roman forts. The campaign forced an expensive Roman response that ultimately resulted in negotiated terms favorable to Kush. Why is this rarely taught? Because admitting that Rome could be checked, at alone humbled by an African queen, and as a tidy narrative of Western ascendancy. Yet Roman coins, inscriptions, and accounts by contemporary chroniclers make note of Kushite resistance. Archaeologists have found fortifications, administrative centers, and evidence of state taxation and diplomacy that corroborate those accounts. The Kandak's victory was strategic, not random. It was based on logistics, knowledge of terrain, and political alliances that demonstrate sophisticated military planning again, not the primitive caricature colonial narratives ascribed to Africa. The Kandak's demand for and receipt of negotiated terms, tax exemptions, and the maintenance of sovereignty amount to a diplomatic triumph that reshaped regional politics. If this sounds like a footnote, remember, diplomacy and treaty-making are the essence of statecraft. These queens were not ceremonial. They were diplomats and generals whose actions had consequences for empires. Shift now to West Africa, where the economic might of empires like Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai created a material wealth that astonished medieval travelers. Timbuktu, Gao, and other cities were hubs of Islamic scholarship. Universities, jurists, and libraries where manuscripts on law, astronomy, medicine, and theology proliferated. Into this world stepped rulers who understood the marriage between commerce and statecraft. The trans-Saharan trade moved gold, salt, and scholars across deserts. Cities minted coinage, collected taxes, and maintained courts. In this milieu arose queens who leveraged commerce for political power. Control of caravan routes meant control of the flow of capital. One queen in this tradition consolidated ports, redirected trade networks, and levied tariffs that filled state treasuries. Her government patronized scholars, built mosques, and sponsored learning that had a cascading effect. Literacy and legal codes strengthened political legitimacy, and the city-states became centers of an intellectual world that linked West Africa to the broader Islamic civilization. European observers, when they finally encountered these cities centuries later, could not easily digest the reality. A literate, urbanized, mercantile society with centralized authority. So what did they do? Downplay, reframe, or invent foreign origins for the achievements they found. That the manuscripts and ruins remain, a stubborn record of African urban sophistication and a setting in which women could and did exercise sovereign power. Now meet Queen Amina of Zatzau, often called Amina of Zario, warrior queen whose memory survives in Hausa oral tradition and in the stone walls she's credited with building. She appears in accounts as an expansionist leader who organized cavalry and constructed fortified towns across a region of what is now northern Nigeria. Soldiers in her army were not ceremonial guards. Contemporary descriptions and surviving fortifications suggest organized military logistics, supply lines, siege tactics, and fortified strongholds that facilitated regional administration. Her campaigns secured trade routes and consolidated states in an area critical for trans-Saharan commerce. This wasn't mere local raiding, it was state expansion with strategic depth. British colonial chroniclers initially dismissed Amina as legend. Later scholarship, archaeology, and the persistence of oral history confirmed her reach. Walls and city plans traced to rulers who centralized power and fortified urban centers. Amina's story also undermines the stereotype of passive African women. She reportedly chose not to marry because she would not share authority. Instead, she built a career of sovereign command and governance. Her legacy reveals how gender roles in African polities could differ dramatically from European norms, permitting women to wield military and administrative power at levels equivalent to men. That social flexibility produced leaders who defended economic sovereignty and urban development against outside pressure and internal fragmentation. We now fast forward to the early modern period and the Atlantic world, where the Portuguese and other Europeans arrived seeking gold, slaves, and new trading posts. In this era, one queen stands out for a lifetime of resistance. Nzinga, also spelled Nzinga or Nzingambandia of Ndongo and Matamba, in modern Angola. Her career spans diplomacy, guerrilla warfare, and political survival in a world where European firepower and slave raiding were reshaping African politics. Nzinga learned European languages and religion when strategically useful. She negotiated treaties, switched alliances, and reorganized social structures to absorb refugees and bolster her ranks. She offered sanctuary to runaway slaves and built an army from diverse elements: former captives, mercenaries, and local levies, forming a resilient military and social base. Portuguese accounts alternately demonize and grudgingly admire her. She was called witch or sorceress in official records, while private reports acknowledged her strategic cunning. For 30 years she kept Portuguese expansion at bay. She employs scorched earth policies, ambushes, and naval tactics in riverine terrain that neutralized European naval superiority. Nzinga's defiance did not solely reflect obstinacy. It was a coherent national strategy to protect sovereignty and control regional flows of captives and commodities. Her death, old and undefeated, left a legacy of statecraft and resistance that inspired later anti-colonial struggles. Nzinga's story shows how Africans adapted militarily and politically to the new pressures of the Atlantic trade without capitulating. Returning to the Nile and Horn region, consider the story of a queen often folded into legend, the Queen of Sheba's descendants in Ethiopian tradition, whose dynasty, local chronicles say, shaped state identity for millennia. Ethiopia maintained Christian kingdoms with literate bureaucracies, royal chronicles, and diplomatic engagement across the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean world. The Solomonic claim, tracing lineage to a child of the Sheba-Solomon encounter, became political theology that buttressed centuries of Ethiopian sovereignty. That theology wasn't idle myth-making, it legitimized institutions, the monarchy, the church, and noble houses. These institutions managed taxation, military levies, and foreign relations that allowed Ethiopia to survive waves of invaders and to negotiate its own terms with surrounding powers. In the medieval period, when Europe's own boundaries were in flux, Ethiopia maintained a coherent imperial identity. European chroniclers sometimes described Abyssinia with exoticism, but Arab geographers and travelers left account after account of Ethiopian churches, monasteries, and royal courts. The point is not to sanctify ancient polities, but to insist on their complexity. Ethiopia's traditions of queenly power, dynastic naming, and state-building reveal a continuity of political sophistication incompatible with narratives that reduce Africa to prehistory before European contact. We should also examine how colonial and European historiography actively erase and reinterpreted evidence. When archaeologists and explorers found monumental ruins, the impulse was often to outsource credit. Phoenicians, Arabs, or mythical outsiders were invoked rather than acknowledging African workmanship. When written records existed, they were sidelined as local lore and deemed unreliable. Libraries and manuscripts in Timbuktu and other centers were threatened, looted, or relegated to archives inaccessible to the populations they described. Museums in Europe acquired artifacts without full provenance and then reframed them as evidence of outside influence. Deliberate narrative surgery. This intellectual pillage served legal and moral ends. If colonizers could tell themselves Africa had no history, they could rationalize taking land and people. The idea that Africans lacked cities, literacy, and engineering became curriculum, reinforced by the textbooks that have shaped public perception for 2 centuries. That curriculum is not neutral. It was constructed by courts, missionaries, and colonial administrators whose jobs depended on maintaining a hierarchy. So when we recount the lives of queens who commanded armies and built institutions, we are not indulging nostalgia. We are correcting a structural bias in the record. These corrections restore historical causality. African polities produced innovation, governance, and world historical actors long before European imperialism reorganized global flows of power and capital. Amina Kushite warrior queen stood against the might of Rome. Roman records describe her as a relentless threat. Kushite memory celebrates her as a defender of sovereignty. She led bold raids into Roman-controlled Egypt, destroyed garrisons, and famously seized a bronze head of Emperor Augustus, burying it under temple steps so people would walk over Rome's image forever. Rome expected an easy victory, but instead met a strategic, disciplined resistance. Amina used the desert terrain, local alliances, and guerrilla tactics Rome could not counter. After years of costly battles, the empire agreed to a rare treaty. Kush would remain autonomous and exempt from Roman taxes. This outcome shattered the myth of Rome's invincibility. It also revealed the true strength of the Kushite state: skilled administrators, master builders, metalworkers, and a coordinated military capable of defending its borders. Amina proved that African power was not only seen in pyramids and monuments, but in diplomacy, strategy, and organized statecraft. West African rulers built strong states by controlling trade, taxation, and resources. Timbuktu's manuscripts show advanced legal and commercial systems. Female rulers also used caravan routes, tolls, and ports to enrich their kingdoms, patronize scholars, and secure ideological authority. This economic base enabled them to field armies, build defenses, and sustain long-term resistance, making their power durable and systemic. Historians reevaluate African queens through interdisciplinary evidence, correcting biased sources and overlooked oral histories, though public understanding still lags behind. Amina's fortifications reveal organized governance, urban planning, and military capacity, showing African state complexity developed through its own institutions and networks. Nzinga used adaptive diplomacy, alliances, and social reorganization to resist Portuguese power, building a resilient, multi-ethnic state despite colonial propaganda. Benin bronzes and Kushite technologies show advanced African craftsmanship, organized guilds, and state-backed infrastructure, proving queens led capable, technologically sophisticated economies. Imperial renaming and misattribution erased African authorship. Restoring provenance returns agency to communities and the queens whose commissioned works embodied sovereign power. African queens governed through kinship, ritual authority, councils, and market regulation, sustaining legitimacy and centralized power without mirroring European institutions' sophisticated systems suited to their own societies. Timbuktu's manuscripts and rich oral traditions prove Africans maintain deep historical consciousness. Combined sources reveal enduring memory systems that preserve Queen's histories. Erasing history enables domination, reclaiming it empowers political imagination. Remembered queens inspire resistance, cultural pride, and renewed agency in post-colonial nation-building. African queens reveal female rulership was institutional and effective, disproving patriarchal universality and offering deep historical precedents for women's political authority worldwide. Public memory grows through films, curricula, museums, and digital archives that center African agency, balancing accessible storytelling with scholarly rigor to honor these queens. Shibo, the Kandakes, Amina, Aminarinas, and Nzinga show Africa's strategic governance. Reclaiming their erased histories demands evidence, narration, and moral clarity. These queens were complex human leaders, mothers, strategists, diplomats whose choices shaped nations. Restoring their full humanity helps communities recover dignity and historical continuity. Remembering is liberation. Telling these queen stories restores dignity, challenges erasure, expands visions of leadership, and reclaims Africa's rightful place in global history.